In the heart of the 19th century, the United States fervently embraced the doctrine of manifest destiny, a conviction that Americans were divinely ordained to spread westward across the uncharted continent. This era of expansion was vividly captured in John Gast's 1872 painting American Progress, where Lady Columbia, symbolizing the nation, leads settlers into the luminous west, while those left behind are shrouded in darkness. Amidst this fervor, the Minnesota Territory emerged as the 32nd state in the Union, marking a pivotal moment in the nation's westward march. Before statehood, Minnesota was home to a mere 7,000 settlers, but within 3 years, its population exploded to over 172,000, drawn by its fertile soil and strategic location near the Great Lakes. However, this rapid influx spelled trouble for the Dakota Sioux, who had lived in the region for centuries. Over the preceding decade, the U.S. had pressured the Dakota into signing treaties from 1851 to 1858, stripping them of 24 million acres of land in exchange for promises of $1,666,000 in small reservations. The Dakota's once vast homeland was now reduced to 2 narrow strips of land, signaling a profound transformation and the encroaching shadows of displacement. These entities became recognized as the Upper Sioux or Yellow Medicine Agency and the Lower Sioux or Redwood Agency. However, the Dakota people were profoundly dissatisfied with their new settlement. The area primarily consisted of open prairie, which was a stark contrast to the woodlands they had relied on for hunting and fishing for centuries. The federal government, disconnected from the traditional lifestyle of the proud Dakota, anticipated that they would cultivate the prairie land despite having minimal resources to do so. In the spring of 1858, Southern Dakota chiefs traveled with Agent Joseph R. Brown to Washington, D.C., seeking to negotiate an increase in their annual payments. Instead, they ended up signing 2 additional treaties, which resulted in the relinquishment of another 1,000,000 acres on the north side of the Minnesota River for a fixed compensation determined by the United States Senate. However, it took Congress 2 years to approve a payment of 30 cents per acre. Ultimately, only about half of the promised amount would actually reach the Sioux. In 1861, the United States became embroiled in its devastating Civil War, a conflict between the North and South. As a northern state, Minnesota was among the first to raise regiments to support the Union. By 1862, Minnesota had organized 5 infantry regiments and several artillery units, with only the 5th Minnesota having a few companies dispersed throughout the state. The Dakota observed that many of Minnesota's warriors had departed. That same year, additional factors accelerated the impending uprising. Minnesota is notorious for its severe winters, and in 1861, the state experienced one of its most catastrophic winters. While everyone suffered, the Dakota were undoubtedly the hardest hit, with their population nearing starvation. Compounding their plight, the annual payments that were expected in June 1862 failed to arrive. The delay was attributed to a sluggish and unresponsive Congress. It was not until August 16, 1862, that $71,000 in annual fees reached St. Paul, the capital of the state. When confronted about the situation, Trader Andrew Merritt callously remarked that the Dakota could eat grass or their own dung. This statement ignited intense anger among the Dakota people. On August 17, 1862, 4 Indian men were hunting along the Minnesota River when they came across the small village of Acton. There they encountered the home of Robertson Jones and his family. One of the men attempted to steal eggs from Mr. Jones's farm, while another tried to intervene, reminding him that the eggs belonged to a white man. To avoid being seen as cowardly, he boasted that he would shoot Robertson to demonstrate his fearlessness towards whites. Later, the 4 men approached Mr. Jones as he returned to his homestead, inviting him to participate in a shooting contest. Mr. Jones, perceiving them as friendly, accepted the invitation. However, this friendliness was merely a ruse, as the 4 men turned on him and shot him dead. The violence did not end there. They also killed Mrs. Jones and several others in the town. Only 2 women managed to escape to a nearby house, where they alerted others to the murders, while the 4 men fled on stolen horses. The news spread quickly throughout the Dakota camp, reaching Chiefs Big Eagle and Little Crow. Faced with uncertainty about the future, the leaders of the Lower Sioux bands convened at Little Crow's village. It became clear that a revolt against the United States was becoming unavoidable, marking a critical turning point for many. Even those who disapproved of the actions of the four men found themselves increasingly supportive of a broader uprising. To organize this effort, the Dakota needed a command structure, and many chiefs favored Little Crow due to his prior experience in dealing with the notorious Chief Encapaduta in Iowa. However, despite his experience, Little Crow remained uncertain about the path forward. Initially, Little Crow dismissed the men's remarks, stating, "Braves, you resemble little children. You are unaware of your actions. You are intoxicated by the white man's devil water, akin to dogs driven mad by the heat of the moon, snapping at their own shadows. We are merely small remnants of buffalo herds scattered about. The vast herds that once roamed the earth are no longer present. Observe how the white men swarm like locusts. When they gather in such numbers, the sky resembles a snowstorm. You may slay 1, 2, or even 10, as numerous as the leaves in the forest, yet their kin will not notice their absence. For everyone you kill, 10 times 10 will arrive to seek your destruction. You may count your fingers throughout the day, but the white men, armed with guns, will come and eliminate you more swiftly than you can tally." Despite Little Crow's objections, the chiefs concluded that it would be futile to negotiate with the whites. Ultimately, even Little Crow was persuaded to lead the Dakota in a rebellion. That night, Dakota warriors readied their weapons and gathered ammunition, while tribal leaders organized their groups for the impending conflict. The following day would usher in terror across the Minnesota frontier, with August 18th marking the onset of the uprising. Chief Little Crow launched a surprise assault on the Lower Sioux Agency, overwhelming it completely. Agent James W. Lynn became the first casualty of the conflict, and Andrew Myrick, who had previously scolded the Dakota, would be found with grass stuffed in his mouth. 13 individuals perished in the initial attack on the Lower Agency, with 7 more losing their lives during their escape. As the fierce Dakota continued to devastate the Lower Agency, survivors fled towards Fort Ridgely, the only military outpost located so far west in Minnesota. However, Fort Ridgely was merely a fort in name, lacking walls or fortifications, consisting only of a single barracks and a few surrounding structures. Marsh did not remain passive and quickly took action. He first sent an urgent message to Lieutenant Sheehan of Company C, 5th Minnesota, who was on their way to Fort Ripley along the Mississippi River. "It is imperative that you return with your unit to this post without delay. The situation with the Indians at the Lower Agency is escalating." Captain Marsh then assigned Lieutenant Thomas Gear and 26 men from the company to remain at Fort Ridgely, while he took 46 men to investigate the uprising personally. As Company B advanced towards Redwood Ferry, they encountered burning homes and the bodies of those who had fallen victim to the Dakota. Upon their arrival, an Indian man emerged from the underbrush. He was armed and fully dressed, but did not display any aggression. The man introduced himself as White Dog and requested a meeting with Captain Marsh. Peter Quinn, Marsh's interpreter, was present to facilitate communication with the Wisconsinite. However, midway through their discussion, a gunshot rang out, and numerous Indians emerged from their hiding spots, unleashing a fierce barrage of gunfire on the company. In the chaos, 12 soldiers and interpreter Quinn lost their lives, but the seasoned captain managed to regroup enough men to return fire, resulting in the death of 1 warrior. Marsh soon realized that he was becoming encircled on 3 sides. Retreating, the men discovered only one possible escape route, a broad thicket that stretched downstream for nearly 2 miles. Yet even here, they found Indians obstructing their path. The only remaining option for Marsh's company was to cross a river. With courage, he led his men through the swift current, recalling his reputation as an excellent swimmer. While under fire, he successfully guided several men across until he was suddenly seized by a leg cramp, which ultimately led to his drowning despite attempts to save him. The most senior officer left was the 19-year-old Sergeant John F. Bishop. Remarkably, he would leave behind 50 men and 5 wounded. From that point, they would quickly proceed to Fort Ridgely. Unexpectedly, another 8 men who had participated in the ambush also returned unharmed. For the Minnesotans, it was nothing short of a miracle that anyone survived the ambush, while for the Dakota, it represented a significant victory. As the survivors journeyed back to Fort Ridgely, the Upper Agency came under attack. In the resulting turmoil, much of the agency was set ablaze and destroyed. With the agency in ruins, hundreds of additional survivors hurried to settlements further north, particularly to the already crowded Fort Ridgely. many of them pursued by Dakota warriors. Fortunately, some settlers received assistance from volunteers from the neighboring Wahpeton and Sisseton tribes, who successfully escorted dozens of settlers to safety in the east. However, most were not as fortunate. On August 18th, it is estimated that hundreds of settlers and mixed-blood Indians lost their lives during the brutal raids on the Minnesota frontier. Few were able to mount a defense against such sudden and overwhelming attacks. Aside from the efforts of the Upper Sioux Guides, the only barriers between the Dakota conflict and the rest of the state were Fort Ridgely and the substantial German community of New Ulm. By the conclusion of August 18th, the destruction and takeover of the Sioux agencies were complete. The Dakota experienced minimal losses, largely due to the element of surprise. It appeared that the uprising had severed communications from the Minnesota Valley. Little Crow, the leader, expressed dissatisfaction with the warriors' treatment of white civilians, stating that women and children should not be harmed, as such actions weaken warriors in battle. He advocated for a focused attack on more strategically significant targets, namely Fort Ridgely and New Ulm. The takeover of the government position, followed by the seizure of New Ulm, the largest city in western Minnesota, would facilitate access to their targeted goal, the Minnesota Valley. Big Eagle concurred with Little Crow's plan. However, other influential leaders, such as Chief Wabasha, opposed it, likely due to a sense of rivalry and jealousy towards their warrior chief. Consequently, Wabasha's supporters aligned with him, resulting in the postponement of the planned assault on the frontier outpost that was set for the evening of August 18th. Unbeknownst to them, this delay would likely spare the fort from devastation. Fort Ridgely, as previously mentioned, was merely a fort in name, with its primary defenses consisting of the stone structures encircling the parade ground. The magazines to the north were exposed and lacked protection, while the fort's stables and other peripheral buildings were also at risk. The surrounding terrain featured elevated ground to the north and south, characterized by two large ravines and a smaller gully, all enveloped in dense vegetation. Compounding the situation, Gear was left with only about 49 soldiers, most of whom were in poor physical condition. The 20-year-old lieutenant could not afford to assign any of these men to picket duty, a responsibility that would fall to a few armed civilians who lacked the necessary military training. To accommodate the refugees, he gathered them into the stone barracks. Additionally, Gear sent another rider to catch up with Lieutenant Sheehan, who had been marching his men for 2 days towards Fort Ridgely. Remarkably, the swift corporal managed to reach the lieutenant quickly, delivering a message from Gear that stated Captain Marsh and the majority of his command had been killed the previous day. There were 250 refugees at the fort, and the Indians were attacking men, women, and children. Without hesitation, the wary Sheehan and his troops extinguished their fires, packed their tents, and set out before midnight. On the morning of August 19th, Little Crow began to mobilize his warriors for battle, unaware that Sheehan was less than 10 miles away. As the Native American fighters prepared to advance, Little Crow received alarming news from George Quinn regarding the interpreter who had been killed at Redwood Ferry. Quinn informed him that a significant number of soldiers were near the fort, which prompted Little Crow to delay the attack. By the afternoon of August 19th, Sheehan arrived with Company C of the 5th Minnesota, increasing the fort's defenders to over 100. Later that evening, reinforcements from the Marinville Rangers, a group composed of mixed-blood Indians and white volunteers, also joined them. Thanks to Sheehan's rapid march, the fort was likely spared from imminent destruction. Nevertheless, the Dakota were not prepared to retreat. An additional 40 mounted warriors had arrived from west of New Ulm to support Little Crow, who resolved to launch an attack the following day. Early on August 20th, Sheehan assumed command of the fort. As soon as the American soldiers were awakened for battle, Chief Little Crow, accompanied by Macadoa, Big Eagle, and approximately 400 warriors, encircled the fort. Little Crow initiated the first assault from the southwestern side, where his men aimed to overrun the stables. However, to Little Crow's dismay, the soldiers occupying the stables fought fiercely for the horses, significantly hindering the momentum of the charge. Despite this setback, Little Crow managed to regroup his forces and utilize the stables as cover for a renewed attack. At this point, the Minnesota soldiers had a clear view of the Indians and understood their strategy. Among them was Sergeant Jones, a proficient artilleryman. He deliberately maneuvered his cannon to the southern edge of the fort and fired an explosive shell over the stables, igniting them and forcing the Indians to flee. Prior to their retreat, the archers retaliated by launching fire-tipped arrows from their bows, successfully igniting the shingled roof of one of the structures. However, throughout the afternoon on the southwest flank, the combat devolved into a series of back-and-forth skirmishes. As the assault in the southwest diminished, a large group of warriors, likely led by Big Eagle and Macadoa, charged towards the houses just north of the stone barracks, swiftly driving out the few soldiers stationed there with a fearsome war whoop. They then shifted their focus to the barracks, which were filled with refugees. A young survivor, Esmond Earl, documented the ferocity of the Dakotas' attack, describing the chaos that ensued. It felt as if complete disorder had erupted. The war whoop was more terrifying than the gunfire, and I found myself dodging more from them than from the bullets. The fighting outside the barracks sent the refugees into a frenzy as they rushed to the second story. Many armed civilian men joined them in their retreat. An unknown soldier recounted the scene, filled with singing, praying, crying, and screaming. Two artillery crews led by Sergeant James G. McGrew and Mexican War veteran John Whipple repositioned their cannons on either side of the barracks, firing several rounds at the Indian warriors. The projectiles, which the Indians referred to as exploding running balls, caused the warriors to scatter in disarray, resulting in at least 3 fatalities and several injuries among them. Tragically, one American soldier was also caught in the crossfire and killed. By late afternoon, the gunfire had subsided. The fort had managed to hold its ground despite being outnumbered by at least 600 men. Lieutenant Sheehan, who valiantly fought alongside his troops, sustained a flesh wound significant enough to place Second Lieutenant Gear back in overall command. By August 22nd, Governor Ramsey had been aware of the uprising for several days and had remained active during that time. Despite 4 of the state's regiments engaged in combat in the South, he emphasized the establishment of several new regiments, along with the organization of civilian militias. This effort included components of the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th Minnesota Infantry Regiments, as well as the Mounted Column Frontier Guards. Some of these regiments were formed hastily, lacking uniforms, training, ammunition, and adequate equipment. Colonel Henry Heaston Sibley was appointed to lead the Small Relief Army. Although he had resided in Minnesota as a tradesman prior to the state's admission to the Union, Sibley had little military experience. Nevertheless, he assembled his inexperienced soldiers and began their march from Fort Snelling. However, upon evaluating the troops, he decided to postpone their advance. The soldiers were armed with outdated weapons that had been rejected by the Army due to their questionable quality and were sent to frontier arsenals. Additionally, most of the ammunition was incompatible, being of a caliber too large for the rifles issued. Sibley requested superior weaponry, but it would take time for these to arrive. Fortunately, he received a sufficient supply of new Springfield rifles just in time to lead the 6th Minnesota to the settlement of St. Peter, located near Fort Ridgely, which was set to face another assault on the 23rd. At 1 p.m. that day, the Dakota launched an attack on Fort Ridgely, beginning from the damaged southwest corner. Overnight, Little Crow had gained 300 reinforcements, increasing his forces to approximately 800 men. Indian warriors surrounded the position and opened fire, yet the 2 companies of the 5th, along with the Rangers, maintained their ground. Little Crow courageously urged his men forward, but was struck in the chest by a cannonball from Sergeant Jones's artillery. Severely wounded, he was carried back to the Indian camp, which dealt a significant blow to the morale of the Dakota. The charge faltered, and sub-chiefs like Big Eagle had to assume command of the battle. Even his encouragement was insufficient to draw the Braves closer to the fort's interior. As they were forced to retreat, the northwestern corner of the fort came under intense fire, accompanied by the cries of many warriors. Sergeant McGrew anticipated this second assault and positioned his cannon to target the Braves. The cannon erupted with flames as a projectile soared over a large group of Indians, resulting in an explosion that killed several and injured many others. Meanwhile, one of Sergeant Jones's cannons, aimed at the same group, inadvertently fired directly into the crowd, producing a similar outcome. The Dakota warriors then dispersed in all directions, still unaccustomed to the destructive power of the cannonballs. The 23rd would witness a repetition of the earlier skirmish, with both sides engaged in a chaotic exchange. Despite the brave efforts of the Indian warriors, they were unable to close the gap between themselves and the frontier soldiers. While the garrison at Fort Ridgely remained on high alert for further Dakota assaults, another group of 350 warriors, led by Little Crow, launched a second attack on New Ulm. The Dakota Braves aimed to exploit the settlement's weak defenses. Fortunately, the city's garrison received reinforcements from local militia under Captain Charles Flandreau. Upon arrival, he encountered 1,500 frightened refugees in the predominantly German town. He promptly organized his men to fortify the town, which soon faced an attack later on the 23rd. Initially, the Dakota forces seized the initiative, quickly pushing back the pickets from the outer defenses on the prairie. They then surged into the streets of the city, firing upon Flandreau's men from behind. It appeared that the battle was lost until Flandreau and his reserves emerged from the outbuildings and repelled the Indians. Although New Ulm had miraculously withstood the assault, Flandreau's forces were running low on ammunition. He also feared that Fort Ridgely had fallen, as evidenced by the visible fires burning there. On the 25th, the survivors began the excavation of Unhashed and Mikado. It was a sorrowful sight to witness 2,000 individuals who had only days earlier been thriving and content, reduced to complete destitution. Captain Charles Eugene Flandreau was en route to Mikado. By August 26th, Sibley reached Fort Ridgely with the 6th Minnesota Infantry Regiment. 3 days later, on the 29th, another group of volunteers returned to New Ulm, confronting scenes of total devastation. Much of the frontier was likely to experience a similar fate. However, the defenses of the North Star State were gradually becoming more structured. Their reinforcements in the coming days would increase Sibley's forces at Fort Ridgely to 1,200 men. Additionally, Sibley received news of the 3rd Minnesota Infantry's return following a humbling defeat at the Battle of Murfreesboro in the South. He promptly urged Governor Ramsey to expedite their arrival. At that time, Sibley was unaware of the whereabouts or concentration of Little Crow's bands. His army was in urgent need of appropriate ammunition, bread, and uniforms. Nevertheless, Minnesota's final line of defense had managed to hold firm. In the weeks ahead, Sibley would gather sufficient strength to initiate an offensive. Little Crow's forces would be poised and ready.